welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today, we're welcoming back a special guest. We have Constantine Sandis. He's director of Lex Academic, visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. His books include The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, Philosophy of Action and Anthology, and Human Nature. And his newest book, available now, is called From Action to Ethics, a pluralistic approach to reasons and responsibility. Constantine, it's a pleasure to have you back on. Thank you.
Nice to see you guys again. Thank you.
You too.
Absolutely, man. And then so there's a really great passage in the book, in the beginning of the book, that I really liked and I wanted to start the conversation with. So Constantine wrote, in a 2021 interview conducted by Chris Heath for GQ magazine's Happiness Project, filmmaker David Lynch found himself distinguishing between the doing of things and the work done. I'm kind of just happy in the doing of things, getting an idea or realizing an idea, working on a painting or working on a piece of sculpture, working on a film. One thing I've noticed is that many of us, we do what we call work for a goal, for a result. And in the doing, it's not that much happiness. And yet that's our life going by. It doesn't matter what your work is. You just get happy in the work. You get happy in the little things and the big things. And if the result isn't what you dreamed of, or it doesn't kill you if you enjoy doing it. It's important that we enjoy the doing of our life. So Alan and I talk about this a lot on the show, especially in relation to the podcast, because I'm so results oriented and Alan is so action oriented, yes, but he's also more so focused on the process. And
so you're a consequentialist?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Right. So okay, yeah. So we get into this kind of back and forth where like we wonder. I mean, I guess we don't wonder because we have a pretty staunch stances, but we have disagreements on what is and isn't important. So Constantine, I mean, for you, I think the question here would be, or rather the thought before the question would be, okay, I mean, isn't it sort of obvious, right? Sort of we do things, we have results, and then kind of we get up the next day and we do them again. So why is this so important for you, and why was it important for you to write this book and to actually look at the distinctions between, let's say, something like doing or the result of doing? Like, why would it even matter so much?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned consequentialism, because while that wasn't my first thought, those debates between different kind of theories of ethics like consequentialism and say deontology, I thought these kind of distinctions could sort of help with those debates. So that came a little bit later for me, but it's something we can talk about. So it's interesting, and it's interesting that one way of talking, and perfectly good way of talking, is there's an action and then there's a result, and then maybe a consequence is even further. So you may think like my action results in something, and those results have consequences. But I was kind of interested initially in sort of, we talk about action and we all kind of, know what it is to act up to a point. We might not all know the physiology of it or whatever, but we understand what it is to act. But I was sort of interested in how different philosophers, I guess, work without even realizing it, kind of different conceptions of action. And what I liked about the Lynch thing is you can see the work as the result of action, for sure. But you can also I'm interested in this distinction between the things we do and our doings of them, where the doings, it may be a process, or it may be an event of some kind, or an activity of some kind. So there's kind of my drinking some water, for example, and then there's the thing I did, which is drink water. And that may seem like a really boring academic technical distinction. But when it comes to kind of theories of ethics and we talk about right action, I think a lot matters, and we can talk about this in a moment, which of these two things we're talking about, and which theory comes up as more plausible may depend on which conception of action we're interested in. So it may be that if I'm interested in my act of doing something, then I'll be more interested in what was my intention, what was my motive, and so on. Whereas if I'm interested in the thing done and its effects, then that lends itself more to, say, consequentialist theories. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's
Here's then what I would ask. So, I mean, in academia, obviously, for anybody who's ever went to college, I mean, it's all divided. You know, you could take a class in psychology, obviously cognitive psychology, whatever, and you can also take a class in, let's say, ethical philosophy. But from what you're saying is that it's all, you use the term symbiotic, that you actually need to have a fundamental theory of action before you start thinking about ethical concerns. So why is that? Because I mean, in academia, and just the way we normally think of things, right? People would just say, well, okay, action is kind of obvious. You know, we just do these things, and let's actually talk about the reasons for them and whether they're right or wrong. So why would we actually first need to understand what action is, or what, not just exactly what action is? Let me actually make this a little bit more nuanced. Why do we actually have to have a particular perspective of action? Not necessarily saying, because I don't want to use the word understand, because it might not be the right one or the truth or whatever, but why would you feel that you actually need to first have a fundamental perspective of it before actually thinking about the ethical issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. When I was in grad school, I was working on reasons for action, and a lot of the debate on reasons for action was in philosophy of mind. So people would talk of philosophy of mind or philosophy of mind and action.
Mhm.
And certainly at the time, the most popular theory in philosophy of mind was a guy called Donald Davidson, who thought actions were events. So we would talk of action as an event with mental causes. So the causes might be a belief and a desire, or anything else that people would refer to as mental states. If you were a physicalist, they'd be brain states. If you were a dualist, they'd be something else. But there would be these like mental states, and they would cause bodily behavior. So in a way, action actually fit into the old mind-body problem. It was all about how does this mental stuff interact with this physical stuff. We get bodily movement. So you have mind on the one hand, bodily behavior on the other. Where's the causal interaction? And you have like a physical event and maybe a mental event or a mental process. And so that was kind of what was going on in philosophy of mind at the time. But then if you look at ethics, people talk of things like right action. What is the right action?
Sure.
And I would sort of read this and there would be reasons for what makes an action right. So there was a kind of reasons literature in ethics that was kind of quite different from the reasons literature in philosophy of mind or psychology. And I was kind of reading these two things because I was in a quite ethics orientated department. So I was doing this kind of mind and action stuff and reading this ethics. I was kind of thinking, this is really weird, because if actions are events, like physical events, what does it mean for an event to be morally right or wrong? That just seemed like what we call a category mistake or something. I can understand why an event might be good or bad, as in we might think, you know, a devastating hurricane has negative value, but you wouldn't call it morally right or wrong, and unless you think it's an act of God and it's God who's morally right or wrong. But when we think of events, they seem the wrong kinds of things to kind of impute moral sort of language to. And I was sort of trying to think, well, what are ethicists talking about action in a different sense from people in mind and psychology? And there wasn't much analysis of action. It was almost like the moral philosophers thought, oh, just plug in your favorite theory of action. We're not interested in that stuff. We're just interested in what makes an action right. And I kind of thought, but hang on a minute, what makes an action right, or what it means for an action to be right, we surely need to have a good conception of what it is we're talking about here. And then I was looking at these different theories, and it seemed to me that why is it that some people think intention and motive are very important to the rightness of an action, like virtue ethicists, for example.
Right.
And consequentialists think not only is it not important, it's completely irrelevant, and all that matters is the consequences. And I started sort of wondering whether they really had the same notion of action in mind. And that's the sense in which I wasn't out to defend one theory over another, but to show that both were right or both were wrong, because they were sort of a bit confused about or unclear about what it was they were talking about.
Yes. Hence, of course, the need for sort of a pluralistic view on it, right? I'm with you on that. As far as when I think about actions and the reasons for those actions, or rather the reasons that come with those actions, I actually, I wouldn't say I align myself with the consequentialists, because I think reasons matter, intent matters, the motivation matters, absolutely. However, there is something to me, like at least the thought that's occurring to me, which is that uh, when people come up with a reason for an action, sometimes it could be via backwards rationalization, in the sense that, like, say someone needs to feel good or feel okay with emotionally motivated action, let's say, and then they invent reasons to sort of justify or rationalize that action. And then you could sort of question how important is the reason that they come up with if it is perhaps after the fact. However, that's only in the case of backwards rationalization. There could be other sorts of reasoning that may be involved.
Ooh, so actually, I want to interject because
Please.
now I feel like this is the question I've been kind of itching to ask Khan. So, okay, so now, when you're saying something along the lines of, or you're saying like there's a distinction between, let's say, when we do or don't backwards rationalize, and this is what I really want to get your take on, Khan. Let's talk about Benjamin Libet, man. Let's talk about the fact that it's all backwards rationalization. The fact of the matter for a lot of these, I don't want to maybe say a lot, maybe that's kind of an overgeneralization here, but for at least some studies, what they indicate is that, we always make decisions and make decisions before we're actually aware of why we're doing what we're doing. So isn't everything backwards rationalization? And if that's the case, then does ethics even really matter? I know that's gonna, I'm kind of stirring the pot here a little bit. So, but I do wonder, what do you think?
So I'm probably more skeptical about Libet's experiments than I am about some of the cognitive and social psychology about backwards rationalization. Though we can talk about Libet and their important experiments, of course. But to sort of go back to Alan and then return to Libet's, like a more extreme case in a way. So I think these experiments, and there is one chapter in the book about this. So I use the word confabulations, which is in the literature, but it's very similar to what you mean. So I think it's just a fact. There's no point denying that we are creatures who are very easily self-deceived, and in the kind of ways you say. So I think any account of reasons for action that somehow ignores this is not going to be plausible. So that has got to be true. What gets, I think, more complicated is how the self-deception works and what this means for any sort of account of reasons for action, if that's the right thing to be aiming for. So in some of these kind of experiments, I think the data is overwhelmingly in favor of the fact that we are self-deceived way more often than we think. But I at the same time, I think the way the psychologists describe the conclusions of the experiments is maybe ironically itself a little self-deceived. So I think what happens is, so there's a famous experiment with like stockings in the supermarket, and they have these identical stockings, but they don't tell people that they're identical. And I can't remember, 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10. Initially, they thought that the thing that was making the difference was that people preferred the stockings to their right than the stockings to their left, right? So they had a kind of right to left bias, and they would ask people, why are these stockings better? And they would say something about the quality, even though it was the same stockings, and they'd switch them around between experiments. So I think, as it turned out, I think actually they thought it was a right to left bias, but it was actually a temporal bias. So it turns out that they were showing them the left one first and then the right ones. And it turns out people prefer the last thing they've seen. And that's kind of really interesting, like when you think of Oscars and how many films closer to the deadline are released and so on. So it could be that it's not a right to left bias, it's a temporal bias. I mean, and a lot of stuff, people would pay a lot of money to have their items displayed on one side of the supermarket versus another, or your advert on the right-hand side of a magazine compared to the left, right? So this stuff is kind of very important for people in in sales. So I think that all of that has got to be true. Then the psychologists will say things like, they'll use the expression the real reason. So they'll say the real reason why the person bought these stockings is not that they were better quality. How could it be? They were the same stuff. It's that they were the last pair they saw, or the ones on the right hand side, or whatever the correct kind of explanation is. And it's at that point that I get it. Like, I think they're onto something, but I think now I'm a pluralist about reasons. So now I think, well, there are reasons why we do the things we do, but there are also the thing that we think we're acting in the light of, perhaps falsely. So if you just say the reasons are the left-right thing, you ignore something very important, which is that the person really does believe these stockings are higher quality, maybe smoother. And I think so. If you go all the way with the sort of backward rationalization or whatever, it's not that that's incorrect, but it can't be the full story, because part of what's going on, part of what's motivating me, isn't that they're to the right. It's that I think, falsely as it happens, that these are high, and I think that can't be lost from the story. And the way I see it is that the psychologist's story, or the story that the experiments show in CogSci, gives an explanation of why I think the stockings are higher quality. So it's nothing about the stockings. It's the fact that they're to the left, or the last pair I saw, or whatever. So I think what we get is a kind of nested explanation. So the psychology is very important, but it doesn't actually give me. I'm still motivated by the thought that this is tastier yogurt, or better quality stockings, or whatever, or that it's the better film and the actress was better, or whatever. So I think the directing was better. I think we shouldn't ignore these, and that's why I'm a kind of pluralist. I think we've got different notions of action, different notions of reasons for action, and then things get messy when we try to sort of see how to fit all these things together. So the thing I'm against, I guess, is kind of monistic, simplistic theories of this on either side of debates. I haven't talked about Libet yet, but I've been talking for a while. So,
well, super quickly. I love that, because that intuitive thought that that I had to ask about backwards rationalization, that was just sort of a surface level thought. Now that we actually kind of broke it down and took it to its limit, of course you start to think, well, either way there's some sort of motivation or desire or belief that kind of is anyway at the origin of whatever reason you come up with. Therefore that's valid. You shouldn't throw that out because of just that simplistic, it's backwards rationalization, therefore reasons don't matter. Like that's
I think that's right, because you've got a choice. You either have to say the belief is epiphenomenal, as in it does nothing. We think it's part of the explanation, but it isn't. But then human psychology looks really weird if you remove that belief, because it seems to be doing something. I wouldn't buy the stuff if I thought it was worse or the same. So it seems to be doing something. So I don't want to say it's epiphenomenal. So it must have some motivational work. At the same time, that's not to discount the explanation given by the cog scientists who've done these experiments. So there's something very important there. Namely, if you switch them around, my beliefs would completely change. I mean, that's huge, right?
Right.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is, I mean, wow, there's so many directions. This is such a fascinating conversation because there's like so many directions that we could take it. But, so the thing that I'm thinking about is in terms of ancient philosophy, there's this Socratic belief. I think it was Socrates, not Aristotle, where maybe it was Aristotle. No, I think it was Socrates. Shit, it's one of them, where they said, people don't knowingly do things that are bad, right? And then so what's so interesting is when you get into the field of, let's say, psychotherapy psychology, not psychology experimental. And so you get into the field and, people often ask, why is it that people like self-harm and what they call self-defeating behavior? So like for an outsider's perspective, there's this sort of conception of, like the person is damaging their lives, they're damaging their relationships, whatever. But I think it's hard for people to see. I mean, listen, unless they have these problems themselves, obviously, which a lot of people do. But I think even, by the way, if they do, they could still kind of project and say, well, I don't know how you're doing that. I would never do that, even though they would do that. Right. But the point is to say that it's hard for a lot of people to see why people do things that are self-defeating. And so going back to that Socratic notion of like, let's say people don't actively or intentionally do bad things because maybe they're misguided or whatnot. You get this a lot in psychotherapy where you have somebody who does, something that seems self-defeating. But if you were to ask them, and let's say, they were being honest and had some degree of self-awareness, they would say, well, that the reason why it's not self-defeating for me is this, right? So you mentioned the distinction between, I think it was weakness and rashness, right? So, and there's this understanding that like, and even the term weakness is something we could get into, because I don't know if it's necessarily weakness, because you can say, okay, why is a person not disciplined, or why aren't they doing the things that they need to do? And a lot of people have argued, well, the reason why I could never be a therapist is because it's like, we know the right thing to do, and these people are just not doing it. But the thing I think that people really, going back to my initial point, the thing that people really find hard to understand is that it's not necessarily a weakness per se. So going into this context and this concept of belief, if you were to ask a person like, hey, why are you doing this thing again that's self-defeating, they would say, well, it just doesn't feel that way to me. So what you're saying is self-defeating for me has a purpose. So the intention of, let's say, even self-harm, right? So I'm in a lot of emotional pain, and so when I self-harm, it's actually preferable to the emotional pain. So yes, I understand that maybe you don't understand what that level of pain is like, but I don't really have many choices here. So the psychoanalyst Nancy McWilliams, she said, I'm gonna butcher this quote, so I'm not gonna say verbatim, but she said something along the lines of like, for the people who are, quote unquote masochistic or whatever, she's like, a lot of times, they're kind of, they're held responsible for their actions, and people say, well, you are the reason why your life is this, right? And she's like, but when you actually ask these people, that's like the furthest thing from their minds. And it's not so much that, okay, well, they're just not willing to take responsibility, or they're not able to. I mean, yes, that's some part of it. I'm not gonna just say like, they're complete victims. Obviously, very few people are. But with that being said, what the person feels or thinks is that what they're doing is self-protective. So the reasons there, again, may not make sense to you, but they make sense to the other person. So fundamentally, for therapy to work, which is not really my point, but I'll say it anyway, fundamentally for therapy to work, you really first need to understand why the person is doing what they're doing, what their intentions are, what their reasons are, what sort of like pain they're essentially trying to avoid. Let's say, what their even kind of goals are, maybe even if they're short term, because they usually are. But the point is to say that it's so interesting that for people who have, let's say, a kind of a firm or very rigid understanding of what action should be, or what reason should be for action, it's often hard for them to see that, like, yes, a person on the surface might be doing something that seems self-defeating, or like, let's say for everyday Joe on the street seems kind of baffling, right? But those people actually have, not just in their understanding, but they have good reasons for doing what they're doing. So it's like, not to go on to like too much about it, but because I do want to kind of ask more questions about Libet, I want to get back to that. But what's so interesting about that, and actually let me actually tie this into Libet. So then you'll have somebody in psychotherapy, let's say, who's on the couch, and they're thinking, okay, so you want me to start doing this, right? So you want me, I don't know, to start dating, or you want me to start trusting people, right? But here I come from this environment where that was impossible. So I grew up in an environment where my parents seem to have like not really cared about me. Let's say, people abused me, whatever it is, right? And then so like going into Libet and the fact that, we kind of have like these decisions that are not really our decisions. I guess I then wonder, how is it possible first, I mean, people do change. I understand that. But how is it possible then to think like, oh, people should just change, or people should just like think better or think more critically? So I guess this is the question I want to pose to you then, Con. So in your understanding of reasons, right, where do you find that people often get stuck with understanding other people's reasons? Does it even really matter? Or, in terms of just reasoning in general, right? Why do people seem to find it super hard to understand that, yes, here are these reasons that, like, right, they might not make sense to you, they might not make sense in this context, but in terms of the way human beings are, they actually do make sense?
I could spend the whole evening on just this question.
Right.
First thing, it's really, really interesting that you weren't sure if it was Socrates or Aristotle. And the reason it's interesting is Socrates says in more than one of Plato's dialogues, we never knowingly do wrong.
Right.
And it's interesting that it's kind of wrong rather than just against our better judgment or something like that. So that is that's the Socratic principle. and it's in Socrates. However, what's interesting about your not being sure is that Aristotle initially sets out to prove Socrates wrong. So Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics writes that, of course, we often knowingly do wrong. And then he starts going in an explanation of how this happens. And the explanation involves what's normally translated as clouded judgment. So that there's knowledge. I do know that it's wrong, but my knowledge is clouded by something in the moment, typically desire for Aristotle, but it needn't be. It could be fear, it could be something else, right? So I have this knowledge that I know this is wrong, but in the moment, the knowledge is clouded. And then he tries to kind of explain what it is for knowledge to be clouded. And by the end, he literally says, I think we should conclude Socrates was right after all. And so it's in Aristotle and Socrates.
Both,
basically.
yeah, it's both. I love it.
So that's why you're not sure which one. Well, it's both. It's just Aristotle sets out to sort of argue against it, but what we do get in Aristotle, and I think this relates to what you're saying about therapy, is that it's not that he calls it akratic. I think you're right. Weak is not a good word for what's going on for various reasons. But weak-willed is not necessarily the right way to describe this. But the akratic person, so the person who acts against, let's say, their own better judgment in a moment where maybe that judgment is clouded. So in the moment, they don't think they're. So there's a separate question whether I can, even in the moment, know it's wrong and still do it. But according to Aristotle, that's not the case. So in the moment, I don't realize it's wrong because that knowledge is momentarily cut away from me. Even then, it's not like I'm acting for no reason at all, like on random or something. I've got a pretty good reason to do the thing I'm doing. It's just that there may be more reason not to do it or more reason to do something else. And that's what's kind of clouded from me in the moment. And even if you believe, this clouding thing is wrong, sometimes I know I shouldn't do this and I just don't care. I kind of have this view. I think sometimes it's not about clouded knowledge. It's about whether you care enough about doing the right thing in the moment. And suppose someone just doesn't care, they still have some reason for doing what they're doing. And I think it's very important when you were talking about kind of understanding others and maybe self-understanding as well. It can't be the case that all these kind of actions, these akratic actions, are for no reason at all. I mean, sometimes we might act on a whim or for no reason at all, but that's unlikely to be what's going on in therapy, right? And finding out those reasons and looking at those reasons in more detail is going to be important. Before we get to Libet, I spent the last sort of, apart from the last couple of years where I've been doing a different project, most of my time in academia I've been working on action and reasons and these kind of things, and Wittgenstein kind of on the side, though he's what got me into action in the first place anyway. So I've been working on those things, and I used to have the view that I just kind of assumed this. It wasn't even something I had as a kind of, I thought it was a view to be had. I just assumed it as obvious, that once you know someone's reason for doing something, including your own, then you've understood that person. So I used to think that, if I'm like, hey, Leon, why would you prefer Sacred Heart to lock up the wolves or something? And then you give me your reason. I used to think, now I've understood why. And maybe self-understanding works the same way. Once we figure out what the real reason, we were talking about self-deception earlier. So maybe I was self-deceived, and now I know the real reason for my action, bearing in mind all those qualifications we discussed earlier.
Right.
Then I've got self-understanding. But now, so the project I'm working on now is I've sort of it's still in this domain, but I'm working now on understanding and self-understanding rather than reasons for action. And the reason why I think this is a separate issue is sometimes you want to understand someone and they give you their reason for action and they seem even more alien.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I say, why do you like that? And you tell me, oh, because the guitar playing is much better on that album. And I'm like, really? Now I really don't get you. How could you possibly think that?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, understanding someone's reason for action can make things worse sometimes. Right. In the case, certainly in the case of musical taste, but maybe in politics, maybe in ethics.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I'm kind of more pessimistic about the thought that you achieve understanding of others or self-understanding simply through kind of revealing the real reasons or something like that. It's not that they're not important, but I used to think they could do all the work.
Right.
And now I kind of think that can't be right.
I don't know. I tend to think that when you take it a step further after understanding their reason, if you can demonstrate your understanding of that reason to that person, it then seems to build a rapport with that person because then they have the feeling of being understood, and therefore the sort of the bond that engenders, or rather reinforces, kind of at least gives the feeling of understanding. Do you truly understand them though?
Right.
I suppose.
Can I
not.
interject? Yeah. So here's what I love about what you're saying. So I'm actually more like you. Now you're a fucking consequentialist. So what you're saying is like, hey, here's this process of intimacy, right? Like, therapy, what you would call bonding with the patient, psychoanalysis, right? You would say we're getting deeper and deeper. Dude, I got to tell you, man. So the times that, and listen, I'm not a trained psychoanalyst, so just to be clear, but the times that, I've worked under this sort of, I don't want to say guise, but like under the framework of psychoanalysis, like what it does, and this is a Yalom quote. So Yalom would say like, it's the relationship that heals, right? So as you're working toward like uncovering layers and layers of the person, honestly, the only thing that really matters is that they really like you, right? So, or that you really like them. So ultimately, here's where I really, here's what I really like about what the two of you are saying. So Constantine is arguing, listen, from a factual perspective, from a more analytical, deconstructive perspective, we're probably never really going to know what the reasons are, right? And what I love about your perspective is essentially that that doesn't really matter, right? In terms of building rapport, building a connection, as Yalom would say, healing, you need the relationship.
I mean, ideally, you should care about the facts.
But the point is, they're not tangible. They're flimsy,
I suppose. Well, right. I feel like the relationship is more important. But then, is it just all about the process to getting to that relationship? I mean, you could say. I guess you could break it down that way. I would just say that to achieve that understanding, you have to genuinely just sort of demonstrate that, like by either restating what it is that they told you, or in some way summarizing and then saying, is that right? Like, oh, okay. So wait, so you like that band because of the way they play that guitar? Interesting. Okay, what do you like about that? Oh, so you like it because of that solo that he does, that one solo really gets you, right? Okay, interesting. I like Bob Dylan, and I like this song, and maybe that blah 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 blah, and then who knows?
Right.
Who knows?
Right. And then, so, kind of the question that I would have for you is that I guess if we can't really like, let's say if psychoanalysis is outside of the relationship part, let's say if we, in terms of fact seeking or fact finding, if it is kind of a fruitless endeavor, right? So then I guess what are we then doing here, right? So when we try to learn about ourselves, we try to learn about people, and like, let's say we do somehow or other become more and more confused, or at the very least, more and more ignorant in some ways, right? It's sort of like the further we go, the further away we are from the truth. I guess, is there still a point of trying to uncover what people are, what they do, or now are we getting into Libet territory and you're like, hey, it doesn't actually really matter?
Okay, that's a big question. I mean, you can be optimistic or pessimistic about the kind of goals of therapy. So like Zizek, for example, thinks that the point of therapy is the opposite of what we think. It's that it's not to change you, it's that it allows you to carry on as you are. it kind of mentally allows you to do that in a way in
very
which you
Freudian.
might not be able to, right? So there's that kind of view, and then there's the view of no, I'm going to change my bad habits or whatever, or get out of this particular kind of corner I'm in, or whatever. And as a pluralist, I'm not going to say it's one or the other, and these things can have different effects for different people. But I'd say I wouldn't want to give up on, like, as a general rule, give up on the very idea that you can understand another person or understand yourself, because I think if we give up that, we just start getting conflict, culture wars, whatever, misunderstandings, and worse. So I mean, that can't be. We can't just be like, oh, forget all that. That said, I think in a lot of in psychology as well as philosophy and a lot of other kind of trainings, we're sort of trained to think that if we have the right theory and think hard enough, we can solve this. And I think it's very important to understand that actually sometimes there's nothing there, like there's nothing to solve, and you can go nuts trying to figure out another person or yourself or whatever, or why you did that or why they did that or whatever, and you can go completely, and the answer might be they don't even know themselves,
right?
Or it really was something more, I don't know about Libetian, but it really, at the level you're after, it really was because you were standing to the right rather than the left, or whatever, right? I mean, with all the other qualifications, and we're looking for this rational explanation, and actually it just doesn't exist. But even that realization helps to understand more. Part of what we're trying to understand is how we behave, and if sometimes we don't do things, if the explanation of our behavior isn't what we originally thought, or it's something irrelevant, or there is no explanation or whatever, then that helps with understanding as well, I suppose.
So I want to ask you a question then. So, okay, let's say in that kind of experiment, with right and left, I mean, there's another really famous one with like a taco and burrito. So let's say, people have a choice and then they pick one over the other. And then after the fact, they're like, oh, the burrito's so much better, or the taco's so much better. It's literally the same shit, So, okay, what happens then in kind of in your research, right, in your understanding, what happens then when you reveal these reasons to people, right? So when you say, oh, hey, it seems like you chose this because it was the last one. So, okay, the guitars, right? Actually, let's use that because you use that as an example. What if, let's say you are some sort of composer. Let's say you're a musician, right? And you were like, no, Leon, I can tell you. So the guitar riffs on like Sacred Heart are pretty much the same as on Lock Up the Wolves. And I'm like, oh fuck yeah, you know what? You are an expert. Let me give it a chance, right? So then I go back and I listen to it and I'm like, shit, yeah, you know what? You're right. It does virtually sound the same. So like, what do we do with that? Like, so does that revelation actually help people? Do they start like digging further into reasons? Do they start even questioning them? Do they care about them? So really the question is like, okay, so if let's say self-knowledge or some form of self-knowledge exists, what happens when people find out that they are making somewhat, I don't want to say it's irrational because I mean it makes sense, but I'll just use it for lack of a better term, but like let's say they are making an irrational choice, meaning that like they are choosing a taco over burrito because they have to do something, and then after the fact, in order to reduce some of the tension that they're feeling, they're just saying, no, the taco is way better, I definitely didn't want the burrito. So does it matter that we're revealing that to people, and then like does it help them kind of not just reframe their choices, but or to reframe their understanding of their choices, but also does it do anything for their reasons, right? Does it alter their reasons for choosing?
Yeah, I think it probably does. But like I like your music example, because what it shows is it's not that reasons are irrelevant, but what it shows is that sometimes you're going to get understanding by effectively having the same or a similar experience as someone else. So you can tell me your reasons and I can disagree or whatever, and then you keep playing the piece of music to me, and then I may or may not flip, right? So it may be that suddenly I can see what you see or hear what you hear when I couldn't before, and no amount of rationalization was going to do that. It's the listening to the piece of music that does it, and I have a kind of like gestalt switch or something, right? So suddenly I now hear it differently, and I love this song I used to hate, or vice versa, or whatever. But other times, yeah, you keep telling me and I keep playing it, we're not the same. It's not gonna, the person I am and the person you are, it's just not going to, the reasons will run out and nothing is going to do it. But I do think that these kind of experiments, yeah, they're going to, for one, they're going to put self-doubt in you. Like, trust me, like after, I spend a lot of time with these experiments, you're then like, you spend the day reading this stuff, and then you take your break and you're walking down the freezer aisle. How can you not start thinking, why do I think I prefer this, right? So it's gonna add. That doesn't mean that self-deception miraculously disappears or anything like that. And Freud would be the first to say you can bring all this stuff to consciousness, and that in itself is not going to change your behavior, right? Immediately.
Well,
but you start to work with it.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, so I'm sorry because I interrupted you. Well, Freud would actually have said that it will never change your behavior. I think for Freud, the understanding there was that the only reason you're making it conscious is because you're ultimately accepting, these kind of sewed off parts of yourself that are affecting you psychologically. Kind of they're causing these psychogenic illnesses, whether hysteria at the time, some sort of somatic disorder, whatever. So yeah, I mean, Freud was actually pretty not just a materialist. I mean, as I'm sure you know, I don't want to sort of preach to the choir here, but he was a hard determinist. So this was a person that didn't really believe people could change. So his whole thing was like, yeah, you should just accept yourself as you are. So that's why I wonder, and that's kind of why I'm asking about the experiments. I'm wondering, like, okay, like when people really realize this about themselves, does it actually, I mean, that of, obviously, because I mean, I don't know kind of what other research there is, but like, I wonder, do these insights actually help people? So like, let's say if I, again, know that I'm really just, so I'll actually make this a little bit more personal because I want to make this make more sense. So like for me, in terms of my decision making, I am extremely conservative. So I need there to be an answer. So whatever, I'm not going to get into this too much. I have something called OCPD, so it's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So I need there to be an answer, right? So what that means is that for me, the reasons aren't even that important. So as long as I can make a decision, because it's so hard for me to make choices, as long as I can explain and justify it in some way, I'm going to do that, right? So if you were to give me an experiment or present the results of an experiment, and you were to say, well, listen, the reasons why people would do this over this, like, is because like they need to make a choice and they really struggle with decision making, and like let's say they need to explain, again, backwards rationalization, they need to explain after the fact why they made one choice over the other, but really they were just really anxious and they just needed to make a quick choice, right? And taco and burrito, you're like, oh my god, these look the same. So what I'm saying is that for somebody like me, I'm not sure that would affect me. I think I would just go on living like I normally do because my personality style is so entrenched. So yeah, I was wondering from your perspective, does this stuff actually, at least in a minor way, affect people in any way, or is it more like with somebody like me, when even though this stuff, you're like, yeah, so what?
So that's a very interesting case, because I think it shows that the answer, in a way, you've answered the question. It's got to be that it will make a difference to some people and not others, or it may be to some people some of the time and not others. And like we're different creatures, and it may be that if you function a certain way, then that kind of information is not that relevant to you. And if if you function in a sort of even slightly different way, maybe that revelation will blow your mind and you'll be a born again rationalist or whatever, right? So people can kind of flip in these ways. I mean, I don't think these things are going to like immediately change one's preferences, but in these cases, the more self-deceived we are about the very sort of qualities of the thing that we think is making us want to do one thing rather than another, then that knowledge could, for some people, make a difference. I suppose. I mean, we'd have to look at very particular cases rather than in the abstract.
For me, it made a difference personally.
Yeah.
Uh, for example, even the concept of backwards rationalization. Okay, well, when I found out that I would sometimes invent reasons for my emotionally motivated actions, I would then think, so I'm deceiving myself sometimes. Okay, maybe these reasons I'm coming up with are not the reasons why I'm doing these things. Then I start to question the actions themselves. Then little by little, from that observation, maybe by looking closely at my actions, maybe they slightly alter just from the act of perception. Okay, that's one. Two, let's say like Eastern philosophical concepts, like let's say okay, let's talk about like the ego, for instance, right? Okay, depending what definition you're working with, let's say we're working with the definition of a voice inside of your head or identification with belief or thought and making that the same as you and believing that this running narrative you have in your mind is literally you speaking to yourself, but actually maybe it's not necessarily that. Maybe these are just sort of either it could be ruminating thoughts, intrusive thoughts, or perhaps just these sort of thoughts that run on automatic. That if, for example, when I was introduced to that concept of ego, oh, now I'm not all of a sudden believing in all of these narratives that I had in my head, which actually drastically altered my relationship to other people, my own thoughts about myself or the environment, and having that sort of self-knowledge actually helped in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I got you.
And I would even argue for you, learning a lot of different concepts in psychology probably did arm you with ways to, slightly alter your behavior. Although it might not alter your obsessive compulsive personality
Yeah,
disorder.
right.
Maybe there are things. I mean, who knows? I actually maybe I'm being too suggestive, but
Yeah.
you never know.
Yeah, so Constantine, and then because I want to really focus on Libet, right? So I mean,
Oh, yeah.
with Libet, right? I mean, the understanding I think with hard determinism is there's often this misconception of like hard determinism means people can't change, which is not actually what it means. So it means that they're just factors causing the change, whatever that is, right? So I guess in terms of just again reasons, right? So Libet would argue that I mean the reasons are kind of they're more sort of external, right? And even though again you think that you sort of you're choosing or whatever, it's really kind of your mind in some ways making itself up, which obviously seems counterintuitive because you're like, well, you are your mind, right? But fundamentally it's like this not auto I mean, I guess automatic is the best term for it, but it is this automatic process where it's like, yes, it's not that again hard determinism does not mean that things don't change. What it means is that the environment pretty much causes them to change, right? So I guess I would ask you then in terms of reasons again. So so the hard determinists would argue, well, the reasons are kind of like you would say the term you use is epiphenomenal, right? They don't really matter that much. So Libet would say, well, I mean, yes, the reasons matter in the sense that they cause, right? And they make you choose something over the other. But ultimately, like the reasons aren't really within your control in the way we think of you, right? It's really like a kind of external process going on that's affecting you. And again, after the fact, you're like, oh, well, hey, that's the reason. So yeah, I guess my question then for you would be, what do you think about Libet and that notion of this really kind of mechanical universe and a mechanical mind that essentially you, again, there is no real you, it's the you that you think is you that's choosing these things for you.
It's like a horror film.
Right.
I'm going to disappoint you a bit on Libet because I'm not a massive fan, I guess. So it's been a while since I read Libet, but there's, I guess, three things that I'm skeptical about in Libet. One is I just remembered that because Alan uses the word suggestive. Now, if you look at the experiments, there's something very suggestive in the way they're conducted because Libet and the other people doing them asks the subject things like, when did you feel the onset of the intention or something like that? And the truth of the matter is that in our daily actions, we don't feel an onset of intention. We don't even know what it is to feel the onset or a volition or whatever. But when you're in a lab and you're being and someone, a person in authority, there are different experiments about what happens when people in authority speak to you, and the person in authority tells you, when did you feel the volition or the intention or whatever it is he's doing? You feel this pressure, and then you're sort of like, oh, now, kind of thing. So that's one thing where there's some reason to be skeptical about. The second reason is that if you look at the details in Libet, he's talking milliseconds, right? We're not talking seconds. Right. We're talking milliseconds. And now that would be of interest if the decision was a if the thing that Libet thinks is doing the work is a millisecond before the intention, say, or the volition, if there are such things. But it isn't. It's a millisecond before the verbal expression of the intention. Well, that's not a surprise. It takes at least a millisecond to open your mouth, right? So what we're actually kind of measuring, it's not like he's got the decision and the feeling of intention. All he's got is verbal reports. Well, of course, the verbal report is. I'm surprised it's not more than a millisecond, quite frankly. So first we have the kind of suggestive problem. Then we have the problem of kind of timing, right? What it is that's being, and then third, which I kind of touched upon anyways, is the question of what it is for there to, what do we even mean by volition or intention or whatever. So it's not, I mean, I think the experiments are important in various ways because they, if nothing else, they allow us to kind of think of all these things and see how much of it is kind of a temporal, in Libet, everything is very temporal, and kind of think of, how does this work? He's working with a notion that intention precedes action. There's a lot of philosophers who think intention and action can't be separated in this way. It's not that the one causes the other, it's that an action is just the outer expression of an intention. The way a smile is the outer expression of happiness. It's not caused by. So I don't want to sort of say, oh, Libet, it's all rubbish or whatever. But I do have these kind of. I said you wouldn't like it.
No. By the way, so do you know who Kenan Sheldon is?
No, tell me.
Oh yeah, so Kenan was on our podcast. I think it was now about over a year ago. So Kenan actually had a really great criticism against Libet. So Kenan Sheldon is a big proponent of free will. He's one of the founders of positive psychology. Right. So yeah. So Kenan's argument. Listen, I'm going to butcher it. It was a long time ago, but I'll try my best and I'll try to get it in a nutshell. So Kenan said something along the lines of he's like, okay, here's what Libet kind of failed to account for. So even though yes, by the way, he actually doesn't discount that the brain states influence behavior. He's like, but that's not the real question here. Again, I apologize to Kenan if I'm butchering this. So he said something along the lines of, he's like, yes, but that's not the real question. He's like, because these people were already primed for that. So he's like, before the fact, right? When you told, yeah, exactly. So when you told the person hey, I want you to do this, right? And are you okay with doing that? And the person says, yes, I am okay with doing that. So they already know that at this point, when this person asks me this question, I've already made the decision.
Exactly.
That. Yes. So that was his major criticism. He's like, okay, but then if the person is making the decision beforehand, how are you saying he's making the decision in that particular section? Second. So if he already made that decision beforehand, wouldn't you then take that into account? Why does Libet only account for the fact that in that second he said, okay, that's when I made my decision? What about the fact that he already primed himself thinking, okay, I'm going to make my decision when I'm prompted?
Yeah, I think he's completely right, and actually that articulates it better than I did. So thank you. I think the priming is very important because you're also in a scenario where you think this is science. I'm being told this. This must be science. And don't forget the pressure of feeling like a fool if you say, what volition, what intention? I didn't feel anything. Feeling like right? There's a pressure to give that answer, and that relates to, so is the verbal report even the report of a volition or intention, or is it just the report of whenever I finally thought, oh, I better give an answer now, or something like what is it that's making me say that even? So I think there's a lot there to kind of be skeptical about.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what's so challenging for me though, like, so I obviously agree with you here, and I'm not necessarily saying that I'm a hard, even though I am a hard determinist. I'm not saying I'm 100% the hard determinist, but you know, with that said, so here's where I find the problem with I guess I don't want to necessarily call them the free will people, but I don't know, whatever. But people who more so believe that your intentions and actions matter more than I would say that they do. So I'm going to give you another example. So I'm sure you know Massimo Pigliucci. So because Massimo's a Stoic, I mean, for him, he kind of like he bifurcates activities or actions. And so the way he would describe it, and this is something I really disagree with. So I asked him, whenever we had him also on the show a couple of years ago, and so I asked him, I said, Massimo, like, what happens with the personality disorder, right? So let's say a personality disorder indicates that there's bad decision making. So what happens if on the one hand, like you're saying, well, we're kind of free to choose. Let's say we can choose the things that are within our control, and then we could kind of put aside the things that are outside of our control, etc. Right? And so, but then I would ask, I'd say, well, Massimo, but like, okay, but you also have people with personality disorders, and let's say, okay, OCPD, great example, right? So the things that I try to control most of the time are things outside of my control, right? So the things that I can't really, that I don't really have much influence on, because I mean that's just the personality style, right? Which I understand I'm in some control over it. But the point being said is that the thing that I didn't really agree with and I didn't really understand was, how is it so simple and so easy for him to say something like, oh, well, here are these like healthy people. And listen, I'm not saying he's stigmatizing anybody, just to be clear. So because I think this is way more intellectual and academic, but he would say like, okay, here are like these healthy people, right? So these people are influenced by good reasons. So they can think, okay, here's the right thing to do, or here's a good reason to do something, and they would do it, right? And then on the other hand, he would say, well, okay, but here are these people with, let's say, traumatic brain injuries, people, obviously vegetative states. I mean, that's an extreme example. And then I would say, okay, well, in personality disorders, and he would say yes, and people with personality disorders, right? Like, they need treatment. So then somewhere down the line, they get to this point where, okay, now they're able to make good choices and they're able to think for themselves. And it's not, the person. So he would say the person, like clouding, you said it earlier, right? The personality disorder with cloud judgment. But then I would argue, like, but how do you then make that distinction so neatly? So, okay, yes, I understand with some things it's obviously more extreme, like with physical ailments, etc. But like with personality issues, I mean, technically we all have these kind of distinct personality styles. So it's like, yes, you could call one a disorder and then the other one is not a disorder. Fine, I understand. I mean, one actually influences you more negatively than just, personality style. But my point is to say that it didn't really make sense to me that he could just so easily kind of bifurcate it and say, well, no, no, no. So here's an example of free will. Here's an example of where, like, people make good choices. And here's an example where they don't, because it's not that simple. People with personality disorders don't just make bad choices. But then it's like, okay, if people with personality disorders sometimes do make bad choices, then why is it sometimes their reason is clouded by the personality disorder and sometimes it's not? This is all very messy. And I guess I just wanted to know what your thoughts on that, because it connects with Libet. And obviously, Libet would say, well, none of our decisions are within our volition. And then, but, obviously the argument on the other hand with Massa will be like, no, 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 it's only outside of our decision unless there's some illness involved. But then I would argue, well, even people who are quote unquote ill sometimes make good choices.
Yeah, I think I'm very sympathetic to the things you were saying. I don't know Massimo's like precise arguments for this stuff, so I don't want to sort of present this as he's wrong or whatever. I mean, I'm very nervous, for one, about the sort of aligning sort of what might be or even not be kind of statistically normal with what's correct or something like that. I kind of get very nervous. There's a great book called Empire of Normality, Robert Chapman. You should look into that, Rob Chapman. But like, so I'm kind of, even from the outset, kind of very, very nervous about these kind of suggestions that these are the normal personalities or the correct personalities, or I mean, vegetative state is a whole other thing, but like the thought that these are somehow superior to those, and the way and this is it's not original to me, but the people I tend to sort of follow in this is people who think, look, there are certain things, certain personalities that are better suited to certain environments. So you must have read things like this. So that in a certain kind of environment, people with these personalities will either be happier or tend to do better or whatever. And in other kind of environments, people who in the former environments may have been in a kind of weaker position are actually now in a much stronger position. And of course, what happens, and this is kind of Nietzschean, I suppose, is if the people with a certain kind of personality have more power, they're going to create, a bit like Foucault following Nietzsche, they're going to create the kind of environments where they prosper and other people are cast aside as having, not denying that disorders exist, but they're cast aside as having disorders or personality issues and so on. And in a way, there's all this pressure to sort of change ourselves, but actually changing environment, whether it's workplace, social life, or changing environment so that the person you already are can do better and prosper. That's, I think, in most cases, much, much better. Now, of course, there are going to be limits to this. If my problem is that I'm a serial killer, the answer isn't, oh, go somewhere where they don't frown upon serial killing, right. But again, if the serial killer is triggered into killing by certain kinds of things, maybe they ought to live in an environment where those things aren't present.
Yeah. And what I was thinking was in terms of like personality traits, right? Obviously that's an extreme example, but like something like attention seeking. So oftentimes people so obviously, I mean, I have patience with that behavior. I mean, obviously everybody does, but like, so when I talk to some therapists, they'll say like, oh, like this person is attention seeking, and I'm like, I don't get like why that's a bad thing. And so like for some people, they have like this really kind of innate distaste for it. They're like, oh, how dare this person seek attention? And I'm like, okay, I understand it's kind of like, I guess a low grade quality in some sense. I mean, you would want the person to have more sort of internal self-esteem, sure, but I'm like, but I don't get why you feel so offended by it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm above any of this, because there are some traits that I definitely detest, but like attention seeking is just an example of one that I don't, where I'm like, I don't get it, who cares, the person is seeking attention. And so it's just, I guess what you're saying I'm agreeing with, because I'm saying that, yeah, in some environments and even with some therapists, a person would say, well, I mean, listen, if you want to change the attention seeking, like, so here's probably some of the reasons why you should, you could maybe think about it, but like ultimately, no, attention seeking in itself isn't necessarily a terrible trait. But yes, in some environments, especially more like religious ones, people are like, oh my God, like how dare this person? And it's like in some ways ungodly in some circles to think like this person thinks they deserve attention. Like, what are you, Jesus? So
yeah, and there's kind of trends and fashions around these stuff as well. But in some environments, like you'll prosper through attention seeking, and in other environments you'll be shamed because of it. Now, you and I may think, regardless of this, there's a truth to the matter as to whether it's virtuous or not, or whatever. But in terms of sheer sort of how one sort of lives in a world, that can really change. And the reason I said fashion is I was kind of thinking of kind of music genres and think of kind of when, like, when, again, it's kind of quite Nietzsche. When grunge came into fashion, you guys are a bit too young for this, but when grunge came into fashion, all the things that were virtuous before, whether in pop music or hard rock, became vices, and all the things that were vices before suddenly became virtues. So attention seeking was kind of bad if you're kind of grungy, right? So you don't, or at least a certain form of showing off, or whatever. Almost being a good I love grunge, by the way, but almost being a good musician was a vice in that context, right? So what you happen is things flipped, and the people who before would have been ridiculed for X, Y, and Z, those are the very features that they've now created an environment where these are the positives, and the thing to be ridiculed is all the stuff that people were showing off, a couple of years earlier. So these things can kind of change in these ways.
Right. And I love that perspective so much because, again, something like attention seeking. So like so I'll use your frameworks and say, I mean, you seem to know a lot about like metal, rock, etc. Right. So like in the 80s, it was really popular. So like bands like Poison, Skid Row, like these the attention seeking bands, the prima donnas or whatever you want to call them. So these were the popular ones. And then sort of it became more modest because like Kurt Cobain, like, I mean, for the people who know about him, obviously, like Kurt Cobain was incredibly modest. He actually hated attention for the most part. Like he kind of had to do it because he wanted his music out there. But again, it sort of keeps flipping. thing, right? And then in the 90s, when rap music became a really popular genre, like now it became again, you know, Jay-Z's. I mean, Pac was to whatever extent attention seeking. I mean, he definitely shifted like from time to time, but like somebody like a Jay-Z, like he was super attention seeking, right? And again, I don't, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but with that being said, it's kind of interesting even how environments can change. You know, we're talking about like moving to different environments and becoming different fits, but it's sort of also interesting how like in one era something is good and normal, and then in another era it's considered immoral. So now going into the conversation about ethics, you know, I guess really the question is, outside of like these golden rules that we have, you know, don't kill anybody, obviously, don't intentionally harm them, etc. I mean, I guess how important are ethics? And I know this is going to be kind of a silly question, but really with these environments even changing from time to time, right? How important really are ethics?
Or rather, how do we determine what is right or wrong
Yeah,
action,
that's a good
especially
question.
in these different
Yeah,
contexts?
yeah, especially when things keep changing. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was something that kind of did motivate some of the stuff in this book. So I was kind of interested in how we judge past behavior. And this stuff, I mean, you know, unless we have very concrete examples, it's very hard to do. But to just kind of slowly sort of sketch something, um, there's a kind of difficulty in judging behavior from like a century ago or something,
Right.
because on the one hand, you don't want to sort of say morality has, not morality as a social construct, but what's actually right or wrong has changed, you know. So on the one hand, it's not as if, oh, it was perfectly fine morally to have slaves 100 years ago, or whatever. It's wrong now, but it wasn't wrong then, right? So on the one hand, there's this kind of pressure is the wrong word because that sounds kind of negative, that there's this kind of quite very good reasons for thinking, no, you know, if that behavior is wrong because it fails to treat you know, fellow humans as being the same as me, then that is wrong. And anyone who couldn't see it, there's a trouble in their moral perception, right? So and the behaviors that follow from it are inhumane and worse. So that's got to be true. On the other hand, there's something kind of unfair judging past societies by things that if our education in school and beyond has been very different from people who were taught things, maybe brainwashed, right? So it's not that the behavior was fine, the behavior was completely repulsive and so on, but the person behaving that way, it's not that they're necessarily to be excused, and that's why I said you have to really take particular cases and particular people. But there's going to be a difference between someone who's been brainwashed into thinking even this is science about all sorts of racist crap and whatever, and a person who's had a more you know, not that education today is that enlightened, but a comparatively enlightened education or whatever. So when we come to, and that's where for me, when you come to judge the doing of the thing versus the thing done, there all this other stuff comes in. It's not just motive and intention, it's belief, it's education, it's culture, it's so there, you know, the thing done is as wrong as it would be today. It's not even that much better. But the doing of it, that can be more complicated. And it's not that the doing of it is to be excused, let alone justified, but in terms of sort of mitigation or even just kind of forgiveness, that you know, it's much harder to forgive someone who do that today.
Right.
Does that make sense? It's not
Yeah,
not to
absolutely.
sort of
well,
I mean, slavery may be a bad example because it's an extreme example, but
it was so
whatever. I mean, I'm vegan, meat eating. Am I going to judge people who ate meat 100 years ago or whatever?
Right. Yeah. So then I have two thoughts. So I would say, okay, something like slavery. Okay. Wow. I like have a million thoughts going on in my mind. Okay. So with something like slavery, right? But can we just say that that would just be subsumed under the golden rule? Because I mean, ultimately, nobody wants to be a slave, right? So you can make the case and say that a lot of these people just weren't being fair because I mean, you know, they treated other people as subhuman, and fundamentally they wouldn't want that, right? So whereas I would say that's a little bit different from something like attention seeking, because I just think a lot of it is based on envy. I don't really think attention seeking is good or bad. I think it's one of those ethical norms that kind of changes with the times for whatever reason. I actually don't know. I can't really speak on it, but it just seems like it's a little bit more subjective and a little bit more relative. Whereas opposed to like slavery, I think it's obviously bad because most of us would say, yeah, we don't want to fucking be slaves and we don't deserve it. So that's my first thought. And then the second thought, and I don't mean to like convolute all of this, so you don't have to even respond to you don't have to respond to any of them, but you don't have to respond to all of them. But the second thought is right, but this is why I am a hard determinist, because there's so many factors involved in decision making. Whereas I think, we would think, oh, well, it seems like the person is making the choice, but ultimately, yes, it's their education, it's their mental health, it's the support that they had, the support that they didn't have. It's, let's say, the fact that they didn't have particular resources, whatever, right? So with that being said, I think that's kind of why Libet would say, well, yes, that's why kind of we make decisions without actually making decisions. There's this whole host and this whole kind of confluence of factors that we're not aware of, right? Now we're getting into kind of Freudian territory. So there's so many things that we're not aware of in the kind of seeming, the teeming unconscious or whatever. And it's always affecting us every single day. And even though after the fact we can say, well, here's why I made the decision, I mean, ultimately, we don't really know why. Or at the very least, let's say, if I'm not going to be too extreme, we can say that we don't fully understand why we did what we did. So that's why for me, ethics is such a, I guess, challenging category of just like philosophy, because I think it's much easier to think about what's truth as opposed to what's right or wrong. Because again, if you look at the context, you can say, well, obviously this person is going to be racist. I mean, look at the environment that they grew up in. I grew up in a racist environment, and everybody I knew, including myself for a very long time, was racist. I mean, because I was like, yeah, how could it be otherwise? Until like, let's say we got into a multicultural, let's say, school at the time when I became, I don't know, whatever, when I went to public school, right? So, but with that being said, until I understood what diversity was, until I was able to identify with people of other races, there was just no way for me to be different. So that's why I kind of asked, like, is it really ethics that's the problem, or is it more of an environmental issue? It's not so, or maybe it's both, right? Maybe it's a kind of chicken or egg or an either or question that's kind of stupid. But the point being said is that I just think that there's or there probably is so much of a focus on ethics, when honestly, man, most of the time when you just focus on environments, people just kind of get it. They don't think too deeply. So I remember when I was a kid and I was like, oh, hey, I'm friends with this like African-American kid. I didn't really think about like whether or not, what I should be doing to him was right, wrong, or whatever. I kind of just did it. And that's what I think Libet is kind of getting at. Libet is saying most of our actions, if not, maybe not all of them, but most of our actions aren't really, they're not thought out. We just kind of do things. We sort of respond to the environment, like in the sense of stimulus response. So even if, let's say, yes, there are beliefs obviously underlying that, I just don't think we think too deeply about them.
Yeah, so I guess I don't think it's an either or. Maybe this is agreeing with you. So it looks like, I mean, the personal example is nice. So thank you for sharing that. So it looks like, from an ethics point of view, you can now see and say that it's not the case that it was okay to be racist before, right? So you'd got something very wrong. But now, and nor should it be that you just give yourself a pass because you didn't know better or whatever. But nonetheless, you were a product of a certain society, and right, there's an explanation for why one would have had that belief system in that time and place and whatever. Now that doesn't do anything to justify the perception or behavior or whatever. But what it does do is you compare that person to someone who has a very different sort of upbringing and situation, and yet they're also racist, and then it looks like there's something very different going on there, and then it's tempting to say, to judge the other person much more harshly, and right, and that kind of expression, well, you should know better, really comes to light. Because I think you're right that when it comes to who we are, so I'm not a hard determinist, but I do think 99% of this stuff is luck of various kinds, whether it's constitutive luck or sort of situational luck or whatever. So there's so much luck in kind of determining who we are, and then there's that kind of what I don't completely subscribe to this view, but Helen Stewart talks of like flickers of freedom or whatever. So there may, we can disagree about this, but then It's like all this stuff, I wasn't responsible for all this stuff, and yet here I am, and it looks like I can make some kind of decision or whatever. But of course, the I that's making the decision is not an I that I've sort of self-created from out of nowhere, or anything like that. So I mean, look, that's not going to answer everything, but it kind of positions me in relation to what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah. And I would always think in terms of just personality issues. I mean, you could even be in an environment that's relatively conducive to, let's say, multiculturalism, and you have people with, like, let's say, narcissistic personality disorder, and it doesn't matter. You kind of try to influence them, and you try to help them see they're like, hey, you know, these people are like you. And for those people, they need to feel superior. So they're not just racist, they're also homophobic, they're sexist, there are a million isms, you know. And the reason why is that because they need to be, right? There's that kind of personality structure that's preventing them from just being more collaborative with people more generally. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, these are tough questions. I mean, I mean, I still just struggle just like with where the dividing lines are. That's why I mentioned Massimo's example, because I feel like for a lot of philosophers, it's especially with analytical philosophers, you know, it's so easy for them to kind of categorize and conceptualize, although, and it's, you know, they make great arguments. I mean, Massimo's fucking brilliant, like a legit genius. But even still, you know, I kind of wonder, I'm like, how are you so sure of this? Because I think these lines are way fuzzier than, you know, they would seem to be.
So they definitely are fuzzy, but I think like a very good example, because racism, for example, is a very extreme example.
Mhm.
If we take, let's say, meat eating or something like that, say in the future, this is just a hypothetical. Let's say everyone is vegan, or everyone eats artificially lab-grown meat. No one eats actual meat, but then they look at the events of the past. They see, you know, people, you know, quote unquote, butchered animals or factory farming, that sort of thing, and then harshly judge the people of that time. What's interesting is where, like, I think that people, when judging ethics, should take into account the context of the time that, you know, especially when judging events of the past, where somebody grew up in.
Right.
Right. So if that was something that was acceptable, if that was how people obtained their food, let's say going back 100 years, all right, if you want to judge the present, okay, fair enough. Maybe somebody can make an argument. No, we actually can make this shift to other forms of food. But yeah, like if that was what it was, I mean, should we necessarily say what they were doing was quote unquote wrong? Well, I think that's where it gets fuzzy, and being an absolutist about it and saying no, they're 100% wrong. I think that wouldn't be necessarily the best direction to go into.
Right.
It would be just sort of respecting the context of the time that maybe someone grew up in.
Right. Well, depending on what, like, because with slavery, obviously we wouldn't. And I don't think, yeah.
Extreme example.
Right.
That's why I'm saying, like, it depends. Like, there are certain things, like, well, I don't know, Constantine.
So
what do you think?
no, I think the slavery example is so extreme that in a way it's the wrong one for these kind of things, and the meat eating one is better. So I think I kind of half agree with you. So on my view, I mean, it's a separate question whether I'm right about this. So on my view, it's wrong to kill animals for food, unless maybe you would otherwise die, or you know, some extreme situation, and even then it's complicated. And I think if that's wrong in a way that's always been wrong, you know, bar situations where people really would die if they didn't do it.
Right.
That said, so I don't think that's like it wasn't wrong then and now it's wrong. That said, you know, it's very easy for someone, you know, I can walk into a shop and get, like, you know, 20 varieties of vegan sausages and vegan burgers and vegan mayonnaise. It's very easy for me to say, hey, be vegan, compared to someone even 20 years ago, let alone 50, 100, 1,000 years ago, right? So on the one hand, so that's where, you know, it's so much easier for me to do this that I can't compare myself to someone eating meat even 20 years ago, quite frankly, including my own self. Maybe 25 years ago I last ate meat or whatever, right? So there's that kind of thing. At the same time, you know, there were vegans in Aristotle's time, right? So then you have a look at people, and now they seem to me way more virtuous than me. I don't know if I could have been vegan in that scenario, whatever I would be, but it's even you know, me with my own beliefs and personality. If I went into a time machine and I'm out there and I'm like, where are all my, alternatives? And they're like, oh no, it's just it's just fava beans and
no unbelievable whoppers.
and,
Yeah.
and olives or whatever, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just vice, it's also virtue. Like, those people seem way more virtuous to me than a vegan today. Imagine doing that then, with
Right.
that belief system and those limited options. And so it kind of works both ways. And that's why I think, in terms of the thing done, I don't think the rightness or wrongness changes over time. But in terms of, was it more virtuous to be vegan then than now? I would say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Or to be anti-slavery then than now. It took more bravery, more courage. You were risking more. I'm not risking anything if I tweet something against slavery now. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I think both virtue and vice kind of flip, not the rightness or wrongness or of the action, but the doing, the kind of the sort of the goodness of the doing and the virtue or vice in a person doing these things. I think that's what changes over time, rather than the rightness or wrongness of the thing done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then as we start to wrap up, so the thing that I'm thinking of is, I guess it doesn't really matter, whether like Libet's right or wrong. I mean, because fundamentally, so here, I mean, this is my argument. I would say, so the reason why I'm more so of a hard determinist than anything else is because, I mean, yes, even though we can't probabilistically say like, okay, this person is more likely. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me reframe that. So even though we don't know what a person is going to do, I think people often get caught up in the conception of probability, and they think, oh, just because there's a chance that this person will do this over this, that means they have free will. Technically, I don't think that makes sense, because from my understanding, you just don't really know what the factors are. So if there's a good chance, if you knew, you probably would be able to say something like, okay, so I know what all the factors are, this is what this person is going to do. Obviously, the reason why we talk in probabilities is because we don't know that. But I think people mistake probability for free will. Like in quantum mechanics, not to get into this too much, but there's a sort of sense, oh, because there's randomness in the universe, again, because we can't really predict much of anything, you could say it's also inherent fine, but like that means that like sort of there's some decider or whatever. So, but whatever. My point is to say that ultimately the reason why I don't think it necessarily matters is because what I hear you saying, Constantine, is that if you're introducing enough factors into the system, if let's say you do introduce an ethical system, you do introduce inspiration, right, from the past, eventually people are going to change. Eventually they're going to take ethics more seriously. And ultimately what our goal is more broadly is to build a just and a good society. So I guess it doesn't really matter whether Libet was right or wrong. I mean, fundamentally, we are organisms who are striving for the good, even if it's not necessarily the good of all, maybe not in the beginning, at some point or other, as you mature, you kind of realize, oh shit, if these people are like flourishing and they're doing well, ultimately I'm going to do the same. So you can't really live in a just society, or I'm sorry, you can't have a justice for yourself if everybody can't have justice, because eventually they'll come for you. So my point in all of this is to say that all of this matters. I really, really like that we got to this point. And fundamentally, yes, again, whether, determinism, free will, it's not really even that important. Okay. So, so wait,
yeah. Sorry, can I just, I
yeah.
like that. There's something quite Wittgensteinian in what you said, because it's as if, if someone were to come down from on high with a bunch of proofs and was like, there is no free will, here it is, and we all read the proofs and we all agreed with them, then what? Do we just carry on? We just carry on
Yeah.
the same,
Yeah.
or anything goes, and suddenly, so it's not that debate, it's not that, it's a very important debate for all sorts of reasons, of course, and because it helps us understand how we relate to our actions and our environment and all this stuff. But yeah, there's something about this, and having to take responsibility for one's own actions, but also knowing that, when it comes to sort of judging other people, that there can be all sorts of mitigating circumstances, and not just assuming full free will and passing on, extreme judgments and so on. Sorry, I did interrupt you.
No, that was great. I was actually going to ask like if you had a response before we wrap up. Yeah, so why I really like that is because ultimately, again, we're fundamentally saying the same thing. We're saying that when you look at like what's good and what helps people flourish, like that seems to be the most important thing for you, like in understanding reasons and understanding actions. What you're pretty much getting to is some sort of applied version of philosophy where we get to understand or whatever build a more just or a better society for all of us. That's what I hear you saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's not that I'm presenting some great plan for how to have
Yeah.
Right.
a just society. This is kind of very preliminary steps. But yeah, it's about sort of unless we do this preliminary stuff of trying to understand the relation of kind of what is an action, what are the reasons for an action, what's the difference between an act and an omission, what is it, is there such a thing as doing nothing, or is it that in not doing one thing I'm doing another, and unless we understand these things, we can't just enter some abstract debate about which is the correct theory of right action and then try and make social political decisions based on that theory if we haven't done the other stuff. But the other side of the coin is if you just do the other stuff with no concern for ethics, then that's kind of empty in a way. If you're going back to that kind of philosophy of mind stuff I began with, but you're not thinking of action as the kind of thing that could even be right or wrong, then that's kind of missing out on a big part of what matters.
Right, because we're not just machines. Yeah. Okay, Alan, final questions for Constantine as we wrap up.
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Where can you do that? I don't know. Don't follow me in person, but you can follow me.
Wow,
You can,
nobody's ever said that before. That's so
you
good.
can follow me online, preferably. Um, so you can get the book most places online, but if you get it from it's published by Bloomsbury, and if you
Yep.
go on bloomsbury.com and look for it, I think currently Bloomsbury have a sale anyway, but you can
Yes,
get
they do
35% off with Action Ethics 35, I want to say. So if when you're checking out you put Action Ethics 35, you'll get 35% off. I am on is it called X or is it called X?
We still call
Formerly
it
known as
Twitter.
Twitter.
We
What's the
still call
name?
it
What's the
Twitter.
name?
Yeah.
So I'm there. I'm in most places as just C Sandis. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. I'm still there. I've been playing around with Blue Sky. You guys should join. It's
I don't even know what
curious.
that
There's
is.
no
It's like Twitter, but yeah.
but there's no adverts now. So there's none of that kind of, there's increasing noise, right? So it doesn't have the noise. On the other hand, there's not as many interesting people yet. So I don't know. I don't know yet. I get it. It's a lot of time investment, and you're not sure. But yeah, those are probably the best places. I mean, things like Instagram, unless you like cats and dogs, don't follow me there, or vegan food. You're not going to get much else.
All right, Constantine, thank you so much,
This is
man. This
awesome.
was such a phenomenal discussion.
It's always great to talk with you guys. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
See you. Bye-bye.
All right. That was awesome. So again, everybody, if you would like to, buy the book, you can go to bloomsbury.com. Again, the discount code is Action Ethics 35. You'll get 35% off when entered at the checkout on bloomsbury.com. And this code is valid until August 31st, 2025. Otherwise, if you like the episode, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.